Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin, here with you for episode 10 on what is Friday, January 10. Today, I'm joined by Andrew Nachemson, former managing editor of Frontier Myanmar and still a freelance journalist with many years' experience covering the revolution in Myanmar. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Luke.
Now, as is our custom, I'll begin with a news digest for the week. It started with the military announcing a prisoner amnesty for Myanmar's Independence Day on January 4. And according to the Army, 5,864 prisoners were released nationwide, including 180 foreigners. And 144 life sentences were also commuted down to 15 years imprisonment. Very few of those released, however, were political prisoners, with different numbers given by the regime and prisoner support organisations. But one anonymous military source claimed that 200 of the freed prisoners were soldiers jailed for desertion. Where they'll end up next is unknown. These amnesties are routine in Myanmar. They have deep cultural roots. They also free up prison space and lessen the burden of their administration for the regime. The very same day as this amnesty, however, the military arrested 7 people in Yangon, accusing them of assassinating administrators and detonating bombs near military supporters' homes. Meanwhile, the alternative NUG, the National Unity Government, had its acting president, Dua Lashila, sit down for a New Year interview with Al Jazeera. In it, of note, Dua Lashila seems to have softened preconditions for dialogue with the military slightly and declared that the NUG would be shuffling around its ministers this year, which may please some of its revolutionary critics who point out the dubious character of individual ministers and the group's inability to prevent the armed groups under its command from committing abuses inside Myanmar. And the major conflict between the Arakan Army, or AA, and the military has continued again in Rakhine State and now in Ayeyarwady Region 2 this week. The military has been commandeering civilians' trucks from Batain to support their battles, with one truck driver telling local news outlet Naranjara that the trucks are leaving the town filled with weapons and food and returning filled with dead bodies. Up to a dozen fleeing Myanmar military soldiers were reported as captured by Allied resistance forces on the way out from An to Myawaddy Region on January 4 and 5, and there are reports that at one outpost taken by the AA this week, which is by a Chinese pumping station for the oil and gas pipeline that transects the state, there were several Chinese workers present, and they are now in AA custody. As the AA continues its gains, the State Administration Council is now restricting the movement of people in areas of Bago and Ayeyarwady regions close to Rakhine State, checking documents and scrutinising, in particular, ethnic Rakhine civilians. And in this ongoing fighting, there have been more airstrikes to little strategic effect this week, or so it seems. And on that topic, airstrikes elsewhere outside Rakhine State this week killed civilians sheltering in a monastery in Sagain Township and killed several resistance fighters and prisoners of war in Falam Township, Chin State, where only one military garrison remains undefeated. Bombs were also dropped in Magok, damaging a golf course, monastery, homes and other property, with casualties unknown. But in the wake of the Air Force's regular terror this week, a local defence group has claimed to have killed soldiers and damaged 2 aircraft with rocket attacks at the Dongwu Air Force Base in Bago Region. This is the 6th attack that airbase has endured. Now, airbases are major strategic targets for resistance forces, and without them and air power, the military would not be able to hold on to the territory that it still does. This includes parts of the eastern states of Karen and Kayar, which have seen major exchanges of territory since the 2021 coup. And we're fortunate to have in the studio today a foreign journalist who just returned from Karen State to talk about the revolution there. Andrew Nachemson, you spent a week in Karen State recently as a guest of the Karen National Union, the KNU, and its Karen National Liberation Army, the KNLA, after you made a similar trip to Kayar or Karenni State as a guest of the Karen Nationalities Defence Forces several months prior. Now, Andrew, you're in the process of publishing articles based on what you found there. Since few foreign journalists cross into Myanmar at all these days, Could you maybe start by giving us an excursion overview? Where did you go? What were your priorities while you were there? And then maybe how did you compare Karen State to Kayah State?
I was in Karen State for 6 or 7 days. I actually would have stayed longer, but the KNU kind of wanted to get me in and out because I spent about 12 days in Kayah State, and I was kind of hoping to have a similar amount of time. But yeah, I think they wanted to get me in and out, and they took me all over the place. And it felt like we were just always quite close to the front lines. So the first night we spent in a jungle camp with the KNLA, and we could hear mortars going off that sounded a mile or two away. And then we woke up in the morning and we could hear small arms fire, also very, very close. We heard planes flying over us. Whereas in Kayah State, it felt like Messe and Damoso were very, very stable. They felt almost entirely normal. And when we went into Loika, okay, that felt very sketchy because we were on the streets of Loika where there was active fighting. But then it was like we were retreating to a sanctuary when we went back to Damoso. Whereas in Karen State, it feels like the front lines are not quite as fixed. And I think that's, again, maybe something that goes back to the longevity of this conflict because it's just been decades of guerrilla insurgency. So you have these kind of pockets that are controlled by the KNU that the military has a hard time accessing, but then the military has their own pockets. And, we'd go through a military checkpoint and then a DKBA checkpoint and then a KNU checkpoint. And then another time we would go through like a BGF checkpoint and a KNU checkpoint and a KNU KNLA Peace Council checkpoint and then another KNU checkpoint. So there was this much more kind of fixed thing. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, the Karen trip, it felt more like we were in the thick of things the whole time. We entered through Myawaddy Township, and we then went up to Kakarek and Chinsakji Township. So we were on the outskirts of Myawaddy and Kakarek, but those are still under regime control. We went to Chaikdon, which is now under KNU control, and we also went to Lake Kha, which has only relatively recently come back to KNU control and even more recently become safe to return to because it was riddled with landmines and various explosives. They even told me there were some houses that were like rigged with grenades. So if you open the door or a window, a grenade would go off. But the KNU now feels pretty confident that Lake Kha has been demined and people were starting to return when I was there. And then in terms of what I was looking for, I mean, there are a couple things, wanted to update the situation on the Aung Zaya column and the Asian Highway. The KNU has managed to retain control over large stretches of the Asian Highway, which is pretty unprecedented and obviously becoming a big deal for Thailand. And then I also wanted to look at the KNU's administration. They've conquered new territory, including towns. How have they been rolling out their administration? What does that look like? And then I also just wanted to get a sense of how people were feeling because the Karen conflict is the longest running conflict in Myanmar. There is a sense now among a lot of people, I'm not saying whether or not it's true, but there is a sense now that the revolution is closer to achieving victory than ever before. So how is that playing out with this group that's been fighting longer than anybody else? Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that wrap. Let's start with the Operation Aung Zaya column and the road to Myawaddy, which is also called the Asia Highway. The Myanmar military has been trying to push east up this road for 9 months now in order to retake full control of the Thailand border town from, we could say, their wary caretaker allies, the Kayah State Border Guard Force. They haven't got there yet, and dozens of soldiers have defected or surrendered to the KNLA and the Cobra Column since April. So is Operation Aung Zaya over? Was it just a total disaster for the military? Or is the KNLA nervous that it could be re-energized and make further progress?
Yeah, so actually we also, another major town that we went to was Thinganyanang, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that sits right on the Asian highway. And that was quite devastated when I was there, although people were also, again, starting to return, but it was much more visibly damaged than Chaikdon had been. But yeah, from talking to the KNLA, I mean, they characterize the Aung Zaya column as just a total unmitigated failure for the military, and a total kind of victory for the KNLA. Because I think the stated objective of the Aung Zaya column was to come down the Asian highway, retake control of it, retake control of Thinganyanang, and kind of relieve the forces that had been pinned down in Myawaddy. And obviously, from that perspective, it has completely failed. I was in Thinganyanang with the KNLA. We were driving up and down the Asian highway. We were able to go right to the outskirts of Myawaddy, where there hasn't been any relieving of the forces there, and they're still incredibly dependent on the Cayenne State Border Guard Force to maintain Myawaddy, which I think is a position the military really doesn't want to be in because they don't know if they can trust the BGF. And I think the BGF is kind of just playing both sides. And if it looks like the military is in a bad position, the BGF would turn on them, was the sense that I got, including from on the ground experiences there. In some other ways, you could argue that the Aung Zaya column did achieve some successes in terms of the fact that it drew the KNLA's attention. Maybe that prevented them from expanding deeper into places like Bako region because they were like, okay, we have to really focus on repelling this column. My understanding is that they used a lot of ammunition in doing so, and the ammunition problem we're seeing replicated in Kayah State and Karen State. In both places, these groups have mentioned ammunition shortages, and in Kayah State, that led to them being unable to hold on to Loika. And in Karen State, it's kind of not really clear how it's going to play out yet. But taking a step back, if you looked at the Aung Zaya column and its objectives before it started, and you look at the situation we're in today, you have to say it's been a victory for the KNLA, even if there's some pros and cons. I think there's a pretty clear overall winner and loser.
So you were going up and down the highway. Did you meet anyone who was involved in its defense? Anyone who was, countering Operation ZR? What did they say?
Yeah, so it was Sakha, who is the commander of the Cobra column. We met him at his, hidden forest camp, and he was telling us a bit about the early days of the Aung Zaya column, and he was there because the Cobra column's been very involved in repelling this. And he said in the beginning they were just kind of marching side by side down the middle of the highway, armored vehicles just coming down the middle of the highway. And the first thing that they did was just use a sniper to kill one of the commanding officers, and everybody scattered and ran. And he said they were able to do this like multiple times throughout the course of the counter campaign to the Aung Zaya column. And after a while, he said they started more often going into the jungle to try to advance through the jungle under the cover of the jungle. But this is incredibly dense jungle that the Karen forces know very, very well. So that also just left them more exposed to ambushes. And another anecdote that I was told that was tragic, actually, is there's a famous sniper. No one knows who he is. No one knows his identity. But a rumor ran around that it was a woman in the KNLA, a specific woman. And within days of that rumor going around, the woman was killed, assassinated by the military. So they're trying very, very, very hard to find this sniper, but so far they have not been able to.
So, we've said the Karen State BGF has been taking care of Myawaddy for the military for many months now. And you've mentioned their sort of ambivalent position, perched between the KNLA and its allies and the military. What did the KNLA say to you about the Border Guard Force and this hedging?
So a lot of the KNU people that I spoke to seemed quite confident, or at least they wanted me to think that they were quite confident that the BGF is really on their side. And, this includes being able to pass through various BGF checkpoints all over Karen State. KNLA soldiers can do that fairly easily. This includes the BGF leaking them intelligence information ahead of assaults on military bases and stuff like that. My maybe more cynical interpretation is that the BGF is just very genuinely playing both sides. But when we say playing both sides, like they're literally giving military advantages to the military regime and the KNLA so that both sides owe them something. And then whoever looks like they're on top, they can throw their weight behind. I think the BGF is just incredibly cynical and they're opportunistic. They're very, very opportunistic. If it looks like the KNU is winning and it looks like the military is really on its last legs and all it would take is the BGF kind of joining the KNU to push the military over the edge, I think they would. And if it looks like the military is going to come out on top, I think that they would, realign with the military.
Okay, and what about their opinion of the gambling and the scam industries that are entrenched in Border Guard Force areas? Just this week, a famous Chinese actor was trafficked to and was rescued from a Myawaddy scam center. He flew from China to Bangkok, got on a minivan, found himself there. And this has, again, thrown international attention on the border and, frankly, the many, many prisoners who are still in those compounds. Once more, international attention is focused once more on Myawaddy scam centers.
Yeah, we talked about that. I think it's not just the BGF also, it's the DKBA, and the DKBA has massively expanded its involvement in the scam industry. And actually a lot of groups are relocating from BGF territory to DKBA territory in a coordinated kind of thing. And the DKBA territory goes right up to the edge of KNU territory, and there's a scam center like right on the border of DKBA and KNU territory. And the KNU knows that this is bad. I mean, I think both ethically and pragmatically, they don't want to be associated with this because of the reputational damage it could incur. And they also just think that this is something that should not be happening. But I think they also rightly judge that they don't have the capacity to take on the DKBA, the BGF, and the Myanmar military at the same time. They say that they're very willing to work with the international community to facilitate rescues and stuff. I think they see that as a kind of win-win. They get people out and they get to increase their own reputation and also their own legitimacy by like engaging with foreign countries that they normally wouldn't have a reason to engage with. So it kind of like further integrates them into the international community. But I think at the same time, they're like very afraid of becoming too associated with this problem. So I think that's the kind of delicate balance that they're trying to walk. And I think it's actually even a bigger thing in Payathonzu, where there's always been this mixed control between the BGF, DKBA, KNU, and even the Myanmar military. And I think the KNU is running some of the public administration of Payathonzu. The Myanmar military is still in control of like the official border crossing. And then the DKBA and BGF have like the biggest security presence there. And they're running scam centers there. So the KNU doesn't actually have the like military capacity to stop this from happening in Payathonzu, but they are involved in helping run the public administration. So yeah, I mean, I think they're wary of perceptions, but also see an opportunity to work with the international community. And also from just a very pragmatic and I think correct perspective, just they don't have the military capacity to deal with these armed groups, and they don't want to fight. They don't want to fight other Korean armed groups. They want to fight the Myanmar military. So,
Yeah, fair enough. Now you've brought up the administration again, KNU administration, and obviously the KNU not only operates in areas of mixed control like Bia Dongzu, but it also has many pockets, as you characterized them earlier, where it is running the show independently. Could you talk about that? And maybe one town that the KNU runs that you visited, it's quite far from Myawaddy and from Bia Dongzu. It's kind of equidistant between them. That's Jaekdong. So could you tell us about your time in Jaekdong and the administration there?
yeah, I mean, some really interesting things. To start with, I asked a KNLA soldier who's been fighting for 20, 25 years. Is this the highest intensity the conflict has ever been? And his answer actually surprised me because obviously I thought he was going to say yes. And he said, in some ways, yes, but we've never before had so much stable territory that the military can't enter. So in previous conflicts, maybe it was lower intensity on the front lines of the battlefield, but they could come into anywhere that was KNU controlled and, cause damage. And now there are areas where the military can't enter. So in some ways, they feel actually more secure than they have before. And this was in Chaikdon, which is actually really fascinating because Chaikdon feels like a totally normal town. It hasn't been hit with airstrikes, even though the military knows the KNU seized it. So it's like a fully functioning normal town with a couple of exceptions. Limited electricity. There's no public electricity, so there's some generators and stuff like that. But when I was there, I mean, it felt like a normal town. All the restaurants were open. People were eating curry for lunch. There were KNLA soldiers at one table and then ordinary people at another table. All the shops were open, selling clothes, household goods. There was like traffic on the main road. It felt like a very normal functioning town, which was pretty surprising. And I guess of the towns that I visited, it was the only one that felt like that. Lake Hakan, Tengganyinang were like actively being repaired while I was there. But yeah, Chaikdon felt like it was normal and functioning. And then the other thing in terms of building the administration, the KNU has a lot of its own people that have been doing this for a very, very long time. So like the Kakarake township secretary, who's the third in line, he had been a village tract administrator for like 12 years or something like that. But a lot of people are also relatively new to this and have been kind of inspired to join because of the coup and because of what happened after the coup. So I met somebody who's now part of the KNU's police force, who was a police officer before the coup, a story we've heard a few times before. I met a veterinarian who was a member of the NLD who campaigned for the party, who's now an advisor to the KNU's livestock department, helping farmers take care of their animals, help them when they're sick, that kind of thing. We met people who opened a school, who worked in NGOs in Yangon before the coup. And at the school, they had a nurse who had been a nurse at a public hospital in Ayeyarwady before the coup. So you're just getting a lot more of the human resources that the KNU has previously lacked, and people who are very well educated. And when I talked to the Kakarake township secretary, one thing he told me was that previously it was really hard to get these types of educated young people because all of them would go to Thailand or go to Yangon because there was no industry, no opportunity in Karen State. But now a lot of them are actually coming to Karen State because they're so motivated by the military's brutality to help the cause. And I guess because a lot of people think, again, that the revolution is closer to victory than it's been before.
Yeah, so it is. And, that's bringing up this wider context. Listeners to what's happening in Myanmar will know all about how the Myanmar military has declined in 2024, how it controls very little of the country outside the dry zone, the delta, and the southern coast. And put in that context, the recent revolutionary context, the KNLA could be seen as lagging behind in revolutionary victories, right? So are the KNLA leaders self-conscious about that?
No, I mean, I think so. The KNU has a reputation in Myanmar as being a very old and distinguished and powerful ethnic armed group. But when you look at what the Arakan Army has achieved, what the MNDAA has achieved, what the TNLA has achieved, I think some people are asking the question of why hasn't the KNU, liberated all of Karen State by now? Why haven't they seized the capital? Why haven't they taken down a military command, the Northern Shan State military command, and essentially the capital was taken by the MNDAA. The TNLA has claimed all of the Taong area and even more than the Taong area. And the AA has almost expelled the military completely out of Rakhine State. And I think the KNU, they were a little bit defensive about this perception, which tells me that it's something that they see on social media or they get asked by journalists and something that they feel like they have to respond to. I mean, their line is that they've been doing this for a very, very long time. They've been fighting since the 1960s. They believe that the revolution is going to succeed. They're not in a rush, and that they want to minimize problems for civilians. So you look at Lashio, you look at, Chaume, you look at some of these towns that have been seized by the Brotherhood groups, and they just get pummeled with airstrikes. So they say, we could take Myawaddy if we wanted to, but it would just make everyone's lives worse, and then we'd have to kind of take care of it. I mean, it's also somewhat of a convenient narrative, I guess. I see the point. There's definitely a plausible, logical element to that argument. It also does feel like something that's convenient to say. If you can't take a town, you say, well, we could take it if we wanted to, but we don't want to. And then I think the KNU, it doesn't have the same direct support of a powerful country that the Brotherhood Alliance has in the form of China. Obviously, now China is turning the screws on them to try to get some concessions. But if you look at who's benefited the most from China's interference, involvement in Myanmar's civil war, it's not the Myanmar military, it's the Brotherhood groups. They've benefited enormously from China's involvement. And now China's trying to pull them back a little bit, but overall, they've still benefited enormously. And the KNU just doesn't have a patron like that. So I think it's very difficult to achieve similar results when you don't have like a very powerful state or a group like the UWSA, which is a de facto, statelet to contribute to your campaign.
Now, we've done this a little bit earlier in the chat, but you have personal experience, as we've mentioned, with the revolution in KR or Karenni State, the taking of Loikor. So how would you contrast Karen State and the KNLA with Karenni State and the KNDF, since you have been to both areas in the last year?
Sure. So in terms of the military side of things, the KNU or the KNDF, as a newer group, as a group that was kind of born from the coup, and a group that quickly outstripped its parent organization, the Arakan Army, in terms of manpower, they were really kind of gung-ho, and they were trying to win this conflict as quickly as possible. So they were repeatedly attacking Loikor. This wasn't even the first time that they attacked Loikor. They were trying to take major towns. They took Messe shortly before I came there. They had taken most of Mobye in southern Shan State, and they were really going for it. There was very little patience, and there was very little restraint. I think the Karenni Army wanted to be a restraining force, but they just weren't powerful enough. So it was a very different kind of strategy. It was like, let's win this right now. And I even talked to somebody in the KNDF who was like, we don't want to be an ethnic armed group. And by that, he meant like, we don't want to be fighting for political autonomy 25 years from now. They had this kind of perception of ethnic armed groups as groups that kind of settle into a rhythm of, fighting forever wars. And they were like, we want to win or lose this war in a reasonable time frame, I guess. And then the KNU, they have this much slower, much bigger picture of the conflict. And they had a big influx of post-coup fighters, and they incorporated them into their chain of command, but in a way that really restrained them. And they have control over these groups now. And there was one time when they kind of lost control, and the Lion Battalion launched an attack on Shui Koko, and it was like a total disaster. And some units of the KNU, of the KNLA, had to come in and try to bail them out. And that's the type of thing that you just don't often see in Karen State. It's much more kind of methodical, much slower. Karen State is also huge. It's way bigger than Kayah State. And the KNU doesn't just claim Karen State. They also claim parts of Tanantari, Bago, Mon State. So they have so much more territory to control. And it's really, really dense jungle, which makes it like really easy to do the classic kind of guerrilla insurgency, but makes it a little bit harder to hold on to large chunks of territory, I guess. Whereas the KNDF, they have kind of, in certain places, a different problem. They're a bit more exposed in Demoso and Loikaw, but then like once they take places, it's very clear that they're in control of it, and it's hard for the military to get back into those places.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, bear with me before I ask you your last question. I'm just going to check whether the listeners know about Frontier Myanmar's other weekly podcast. It's called Do Atan, which means Our Voice, and it's focused on human rights issues in Myanmar, produced in both English and Burmese languages. This week's episode is about the strain put on relationships when a partner leaves home to join the revolution. Check it out on all of the normal apps. And now back to you, Andy. Staying on this theme, one element of the maybe more cautionary approach to the revolution happening in Kayah State, as you've said, is also avoiding any catastrophic bungles. You know, now in retrospect, there does seem to be a consensus developing that the attempt to liberate Loikaw, this symbolic capital city of Kayah State, was maybe a strategic mistake.
I think the KNU looks at things like Loikaw and Kulin and feels like their strategy is validated because of that. And yeah, we wrote a political insider for Frontier about the kind of losses in Loikaw, and we interviewed a woman who had been displaced, and she said, you know, I support the KNDF, but they shouldn't try to take a town if they can't hold it, because, you know, it makes our lives much harder. And I think there's this feeling among the general population that they're willing to make certain sacrifices, but then they expect certain things in return. So yeah, I think trying to take a town and then failing, or even partially succeeding and then having it taken back again, can be very damaging reputationally because of the way that it impacts the civilian population. The other interesting thing about the longevity of the conflict that I saw while I was there is there's both this, it inspires two different kind of feelings, I guess. It inspires this real excitement that we're almost there, we're almost there. And then in other people, it inspires this extreme kind of caution. So the current Cockerake Township administrator was previously the Lake Caw town administrator. And he's on the other side of things. He's like, look, we've seen this before. We've been close to victory before. You know, we've felt like we had the upper hand before, and then we lost, and then we won a little bit, and then we lost a little bit more, and then we, you know, he feels like there's just this cycle going on forever. So he's really urging people to come to terms with the idea that we might need to negotiate. And you know, he points to Lake Caw and he says Lake Caw was not built because of a military victory. Lake Caw was built because we sat down and negotiated with the military. So it's interesting to see. I'm not, you know, picking a side as a foreigner. I have no right to do that. But it's interesting to see how the longevity of the conflict and the success of the current campaign inspires these two very different reactions in people. And some people feel like we're almost there. Let's go. Let's push. And then some people, and often more senior people, are like, we've been here before. Let's be cautious. Let's calm down. Let's take it step by step. You know, if we win, we can take the towns whenever. We don't necessarily need to seize Myawaddy right now. That's not necessarily going to give us a great military advantage. It could in some ways be a burden, because now you have a huge town that you have to administer and take care of. So yeah, I mean, both that debate is very much alive within the KNU itself. Although it does seem like especially among the soldiers, especially among the KNLA like troops on the ground, maybe not as much in the officers or the higher ranking administrators, but the soldiers really feel like they're almost there. So it'll be interesting to see how that might play out in the next couple months and how those conflicting perspectives might clash with each other or not.
Yeah, for sure. Now we're going to end it there, but we could have talked for much, much longer. Thank you very much for coming on What's Happening in Myanmar.
Thank you for having me, Luke. Goodbye.
And thanks to everyone at home or wherever you are for listening to another week of the podcast. As always, we really welcome your feedback. You can email us, whimyanmar@proton.me, or you can check the show notes for an email link and links to Andrew's many publications. There are new features up on the Frontier Myanmar website, so please be sure to check those out. And until next week, farewell and take care.